Hello, and welcome to Innovation plus Collaboration Equals Change, how nonprofit leaders of color move equity and resilience forward. My name is Sydney Diavois, and I'm the Director of Community Partnerships and Investment at the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, and I'll be your moderator today. Nonprofit leaders of color are merging funding, policies, and programs to address deep and systemic inequities. Earlier this year, 6 of the nation's leading nonprofit community development organizations came together in a national CEO Circle of Color forum to share their visions and actions for mutual support, scalable impact, and a resilient future for organizations, families, and communities. This session looks to continue that conversation. Today, we're going to discuss how nonprofit leaders of color are adopting new approaches and initiating collaborations within the community development sector, the ways in which they advance change and move equity and resilience forward, but also how the pandemic and the events of 2020 shaped the landscape for these leaders and the future pipeline for the field. I'm joined today by 2 dynamic thought leaders who have been at the center of conversations and actions to elevate the work of nonprofit CEOs of color. To begin, I'll introduce our speakers, and then they'll each take a few minutes to give an overview of their work and share some insights. First, we have Presley Gillespie. Presley is the president of Neighborhood Allies. Since taking the helm, Presley has been elevating Neighborhood Allies' value as a trusted community development partner in Pittsburgh, serving as an investor, thought leader, and catalyst for innovative approaches in order to solve challenges in under-resourced neighborhoods. He has injected new energy into the local community development system and has built a forward-thinking, solutions-oriented community development organization that brings hope, fresh ideas, expertise, and resources to distressed and transitional neighborhoods. Presley, the floor is yours.
Well, hello, everyone, and good morning, soon to be good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with you guys today. I want to thank the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland for the invitation. This is a subject near and dear to many of our hearts, particularly as we come out of a triple pandemic and really seek to find new ways, innovative ways of really building resilience within organizations led by people of color. Neighborhood Allies is really, this is a really important aspect of what we're really trying to do, because at the end of the day, we really promise to create pathways of opportunity that lead to healthy neighborhoods. And I really think as we go about the work of engaging neighborhoods and organizations with innovative tools that expand opportunity for transformative community change, it's really paramount that we build trust-based partnerships amongst leaders of color, that we make sure that we're creating better resilience, a better talent pipeline, but most importantly, that we begin to level the playing field in terms of how capital is accessed across philanthropy to communities of color. There are still far too many startling statistics that show that organizations led by communities of color still receive far significantly less than those that are white led. So there's a lot of work that we have to do, but there's a lot of promise. There's a lot of optimism as well. You know, I'm excited about sharing the panel with my colleague, Dr. Watkins, today. We've worked on these issues together. She's doing some tremendous work around these issues on a national scale. But we're excited at the local level at Neighborhood Allies in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, because we do believe that we really are on the precipice of significant change. And as we seek to really look to folks that have a lived experience, that are closest to the problems that we're trying to solve, and that, quite frankly, have the solutions, we need to make sure that there's greater access to resources to be able to do that. So I'm excited about this conversation today, and I bring you greetings from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Thanks, Presley. Next, we have Dr. Akilah Watkins. Dr. Watkins is the president and CEO of Center for Community Progress. The Center for Community Progress is a leading nonprofit turning vacant spaces into vibrant places. As a national thought leader and nonprofit executive, Dr. Watkins' work began at the age of 14, where she led efforts to convert a vacant lot and abandoned home into a community center in Roosevelt, New York. Since then, she served as an executive leader for nonprofits and community development initiatives, which includes work with the Obama administration, NeighborWorks America, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and the Center for the Study of Social Policy. Dr. Watkins, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation from the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland. I am honored to be here and share the stage with my esteemed colleague and past board chair, Presley Gillespie. I'm excited to be having this conversation today. I think it's time. I think that this country has went through a tremendous amount of pain and hurt, and and especially as we think about the racial reckoning that has happened and continues to happen across this country. And I do think that when we think about leadership and we think about community development and the intersection between those two, that it is important to have diverse voices at the table. It's important to have unique perspectives that can both share an outsider view and also an insider view and be translators and bridge builders and connectors. And I am looking forward to having a robust conversation today, but also an honest conversation today about what it will take for us to transform the field of community development, to get the best leadership, to support leaders of color, to figure out where we are losing leaders of color along the pipeline of leadership, to also talk about tangible ways that we can support leaders of color in their leadership journey, but also talk about some of the challenges and structural impediments to leaders of color being successful. So I am so excited about this opportunity and look forward to having a very sort of robust and transparent conversation. And so hopefully you will allow Presley and I the opportunity to, not only riff, but share our unique sort of lived experience, but also share what we've learned, and more importantly, our call to action. I'm excited because when I started at Community Progress, I was one of two national leaders of color in the community development field, and today I've seen a tremendous amount of change. I've seen more leaders be able to take the helm of organizations locally and nationally to lead. And I want us to sort of really talk about what the unique challenges are with that. And then what are the opportunities? And what does that mean for our communities? And what does it ultimately mean for the families in which we serve? So I'm looking forward to this conversation. Again, I thank the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland for giving us the platform and opportunity to really talk about and nuance this whole idea, this intersection between race, leadership, and community development.
Thank you, Dr. Watkins. It's important as we talk about some of those barriers and the challenges, and especially the structural challenges, that we really just experienced a year where all of those different factors came to bear. So I want to start by taking a look back and asking about last year and how the pandemic impacted nonprofit leaders of color. How do you see these leaders weather the pandemic, and what did the field look like for them pre-pandemic? I'll start with you, Dr. Watkins.
Yeah, so thank you. So let me just start with I think what I think happened after the pandemic for leaders of color. So I think a couple of things. I think that let's, with a bit of framing and context here, I think when I show up in space as a leader, I think, especially in communities of color, which where a lot of community development activity happens, I think people get really excited, right? I cannot tell you how many elders have said to me, you know what, this is what we fought for. We fought for you to be in these sort of positions, these types of positions, making these type of decisions. And I also think that comes with a lot of responsibility, right? So, it's hard enough leading an organization, managing a board, fundraising, managing funders, staff, your work, the overall health of the organization. And I think as a leader of color, especially as a Black leader of color, you feel the enormous weight of history, of opportunity, and people have literally gave their lives for you to be in this position. And so it does come with an enormous amount of responsibility. And I think, as the pandemic was still playing out, and then also with the racial uprisings happening in the country, I think people were looking to leaders of color to really, be bold, to take stance, and to radically reimagine what a world can look like post-COVID. So I think, one thing we've all agreed on is that we don't want to go back to a world pre-COVID. A world pre-COVID still had double unemployment for people of color, especially for African Americans and Latinx communities. It still had African Americans not being able to fully participate in home ownership. It still had a huge wealth gap that only netted 10 cents on every dollar for African Americans when compared to their white counterparts. We don't want to go back to that. What we want to go back to, and I think this is where leaders of color have an enormous sort of responsibility. And let me be clear, I think this responsibility is on everybody that works in our field. This is not just a banner we have to hold. I think it deeply impacts us because I think people look at us for leadership answers and sort of the moral grounding. But we need to radically imagine and then work toward having communities that are deeply, deeply equitable and just and fair. And so I think we fully understand that because many of us have grown up in these communities that we are pledged to help, right? So there isn't this sort of social distance between who I am and the communities I work in. I grew up in these communities. They're my communities. They're my family. They're my friends. They're my associates. I go home to them. I live in the communities we work in. And so I do think there's an enormous responsibility there for leaders of color. And I think pre-pandemic, we felt that same sort of weight. But I don't know if it was as acute as it is post-pandemic. And I will say this in closing is that my challenge sometimes is that I don't want to ask leaders of color to do more with less. And I think sometimes that happens a lot. People expect you to not only do sort of the tactical work that, again, all leaders have to do, but they also expect you to do that social emotional work that is important, right? And then also that sort of larger psychic work, right? So, to create tables, to be a translator, to really amplify the issues of Black and Brown and Indigenous people and what their sort of lives and lived experiences have been in this country. Those things are expected of you as leaders of color. And I think sometimes I struggle sometimes because I think we do need to equip leaders of color with the additional resources they need in order to fully, show up, right? And show up in a way where they, actually can really advance this conversation and they don't do harm. But I think that comes with time, that comes with providing resources. And I do think there's a gap in those resources being provided to leaders of color. So it's like, communities are demanding you do more, funders are demanding you do more, your organizations are demanding you do more, but you don't have the resources in order to do that. So I am always very sensitive about asking leaders of color to do more with less. So, in conclusion, I think that the world of a leader of color is like the world of many people of color. It's complex. I mean, it's full of sort of wonderful moments, deep, soulful moments, but it's also deeply complex. And there's a lot of sort of pulls on you coming from a lot of different directions. And so I do think we need to have a more deep and meaningful conversation around what does it mean? What does it mean and what does it look like to support leaders in that sort of unique space?
That's important. The layers of expectations that are placed upon leaders of color by all of these parts, the community, philanthropy, but also this expectation to do more with less, and thinking about having to do more with less in the middle of a pandemic and a challenging economy. Presley, what did this look like for you and leaders who are working at the local level, who are working in a place-based manner? What did the pandemic look like for leaders in that space?
Great. Thank you. First of all, completely echoing Dr. Watkins' sentiments. She said it very well. What I'll say is I'll maybe provide a little more on sort of, to your point, the micro level or the neighborhood level, what we saw. And first and foremost, to be a high functioning nonprofit organization, you have to be able to really adapt and adjust to the time. So when the pandemic started, we quickly learned from our grassroots partners that their residents and the populations that they serve had an increased need for food, cleaning and sanitation supplies, different types of products and essential needs for everyday living. So as a result, we halted certain programs and shifted substantial amounts of dollars to neighborhood organizations, with the capacity and trusted partnerships and relationships with residents to really meet their most immediate needs. So we saw strong Black-led organizations with deep ties to their communities make the most of the modest amount of resources provided to them. This is a good and a bad thing, right? So the good is that our nonprofit leaders of color show time and time again that they are best positioned to serve Black and brown residents. But on the other hand, as we've talked about, they are systematically under-resourced and continuously expected to do more with less. And so really this has to change. And what we know is that with the disproportionate harm the pandemic has caused to Black and brown communities alongside, the racial reckoning our country is experiencing caused by the death of George Floyd and others, that there are elevated levels of racial justice verbiage coming from, philanthropic and corporate partners. So what we hope is really that begins to translate into increased amounts of resources for Black and brown led nonprofits who actually know how to get the job done. And so, we certainly had to react to exactly the needs of what was happening on the ground, because we do a lot of our work on the ground. And I think we did that in a way that was, quite frankly, incredible. I always have to get a shout out to our staff because we actually grew. We grew our talent. We grew our staffing. We grew our resources last year. But as I look ahead, we really have to begin to really think about how do we, both sustain and develop healthy leaders of color? How do we create the trust and connectivity that we need and the respect, quite frankly, for the work that is actually getting done? And how do we build the organizational capacity for these organizations to be resilient because, more of these shocks to our system are going to occur. And how do we strengthen the pipeline? How do we strengthen the pipeline of talent, of particularly, Black talent in our space? I often tell folks, number one, there's no 2 good days in a row for a leader, right? Because we have so much, when you get one problem solved, there's another problem lurking around the corner. So there's no 2 good days for a leader. So we as leaders need to develop that muscle and that resilience. But to Dr. Watkins' point, we need the resources to make sure that we have the level of professional development and the level of, really just peer development and peer support. One of the things that we're also looking at is really, the mental health of both our communities as well as, ourselves as leaders. And, Neighborhood Allies, we've been partnering with an organization called Still Smiling that focuses on making sure that every Black person has access to mental health services in our neighborhoods, that we demystify, mental health or destigmatize it, because the trauma that we had already experienced for centuries was completely exacerbated through this triple pandemic. So we have to look at our work, I believe, in different ways now. I think we have to look at how do we bring other actors to the table within community development. Is no longer just, housing development, which we know is absolutely critical, but we have to think about other actors and other fields that we have to now align with all of our work. But again, that takes time, that takes resources, it takes trust-based partnerships. And that's what that's what we're seeing ahead. And that's what we're seeing the tremendous need for ahead as we now get to the other side, but actually hopefully we've learned some things, and now we need to position ourselves to be even stronger across our country, because again, unfortunately, more shocks, be it violence, be it climate change, more shocks are going to occur, across our country, and we have to be better positioned. We have to be better positioned with leaders that have the lived experience, that frankly can relate and know that, those of us, we came up to Dr. Watkins' point. We live in these neighborhoods. We've experienced the same challenges that we're trying to solve. So we need to be at the forefront of solving those challenges. And we need to make sure that we have the financial capital, the social capital, and the political capital to be well positioned going forward.
Presley, you started to touch on this, and it's interesting. What is the additional value add to communities and to the impact that we're seeking to make in communities by investing and building the capacity of leaders of color? You talked about the Still Smiling initiative and just to focus on mental health, but what are some of those other value adds for residents and communities by making these investments into these leaders?
That's a great question. I'll start by saying it's even much more than a value add. I mean, it's actually an imperative. We believe that solidarity amongst leaders of color is really vital for sustainable transformative change across our country. That's not to say that we need to be impractical and think we have, all of the answers or agree on every single issue. But rather the collective energy of ideas and support and problem solving ability, the resources and, power that are needed to make and sustain change for our communities of color is absolutely critical. So it's an imperative. And I think, as we think about, again, the things like the mental health space, as we think about how do we connect the dots on wealth and wealth building and closing the racial wealth gap. We've got to think about creative solutions to to problems. We can't solve old problems with old solutions. And but understanding what those challenges are, understanding the deep root causes of those challenges, will require, again, this collective energy, this collective brain power. But it will also require solidarity. We, part of our power is in our convening power. Part of our power is the power to bring people together and motivate and inspire hope. And to Dr. Watkins' earlier points, when people see us at the table or people see us leading initiatives or talking on a national stage, it does inspire hope. It does inspire that things can possibly change, but that has to be sustained. And I think the solidarity that we bring and the connectivity that we bring to each other to really innovate and to create really new solutions to these challenges is absolutely important and must frankly must be invested in. And so I often say, I find myself, if we want to be honest and transparent, I find myself being frustrated when I hear us talking about old problems and old solutions that haven't worked. When I hear us, where I see that the sentiments are that we cannot be authentic, we cannot be our true selves because it might be used against us. I see that. I see that as I work to help build capacity with nonprofit organizations, led by people of color. There's this resistance to being even vulnerable because there's a fear, and it's based upon history, that when you're vulnerable and you show your weaknesses, that it's going to be used against you. When you show that you don't have all the answers as an individual or as an individual organization, it can be used against you. And that still occurs, and that does occur. And if we're honest, we've got to create conditions in our communities and across the nation where that vulnerability is encouraged. Where that vulnerability is rewarded. It's not enough to just go through the motions with good efforts anymore. It's not enough to just get through a grant and fill out a report and just turn in a report. I mean, we really need transformation, and in order to really achieve that transformation, we've got to bring our full, authentic selves to solve these problems. We've got to be honest about what it's going to take, to solve these problems. And I think that honesty and that vulnerability has to be rewarded and not penalized, which, again, if we're honest, continues to occur in many cases. So I think it's an imperative. I think solidarity is an absolute imperative, and being able to lean on each other and support each other across the country is absolutely vital to sustain transformative change. And that's why one of the reasons I'm so excited about, the work of Dr. Watkins and what she's doing at Center for Community Progress.
Dr. Watkins, what about you? How have you seen these investments transform communities across the country, and what does it take to sustain it?
Yeah, so I think a couple of things. And it's really hard to follow Presley because he just nails it. um, you know, so I think a couple of things that really resonated with me is we need more investment. I don't, I don't think that we have truly invested in the wealth of knowledge and possibility of leaders of color at all. We need more pipelines. We need to take mid-career professionals and really get them sort of coached up, get them connected through social networking, leadership development, that sort of thing. So I am part of a CEO Circle, and it's so the largest nonprofits in the country that are ran by people of color. And one of the things we have identified is that there are breakdowns in the pipeline, leadership pipeline for leaders of color here. And we have, when we look at the stats, and I try not to sort of talk with numbers all day, but look, I just need to sort of give people like the reality of where we are. We are seeing people of color graduate with graduate degrees, especially coming into the field of community development, on par with their white colleagues. And we're not seeing them matriculate through the leadership pipeline. And when they and that's a challenge, that's a problem. I don't love telling stories of how we made it through all the sort of challenge. I mean, I think challenge is important. I think, you got to be battle tested. I get that. But I also don't think it's appropriate for people of color always to have to persevere through sort of like unnatural challenges, right? Like that's not fair. And this whole resilient piece, I mean, man, we can write a book about resiliency. And so I just think that, and I'm talking to the field here about, we got to tap into the leadership potential. It's important for us to have a diverse perspective of leadership around the table. It's important. If we just have this sort of one size fits all leadership model, then we're not going to get the type of innovation we need to solve the sort of deep systemic problems we're all facing, right? So how do we look creatively at financing, right? So how do we look at sort of public-private partnerships moving forward? What does it look like for us to operationalize racial equity in place, in finance, in, community development? If we do not have a different perspective, we're only getting a portion of that answer. And so, it's imperative for us to not only have people of color like just show up and be at the table, but really they need to be able to control resources. They need to be able to control capacity in organizations, and they need the ability to try things. And you know what? How about this one? They need to be able to make mistakes, And so I think that is going to be extremely important for the field, and realize that change, needs to happen, and it may look different. So I do not, I think I am a very effective leader. To Presley's point, COVID has been an extremely tough time for all organizations. I don't care who's leading them. And a lot of organizations have had to furlough. They've had to cut staff. They've had to dip into their reserves if they're lucky to have them. I mean, they've dealt with all sorts of challenges. I mean, like Presley said, when you're a leader, I mean, you're never off. You're just always on and always having to sort of think through some of the most difficult challenges, right? And then you add COVID on top of that. And, I think for me at the Center for Community Progress, I led that organization through one of the most difficult periods, of our entire organizational sort of history. And we didn't have to furlough. We grew by 20%. We've increased our revenues. We leaned into partnerships. We leveraged all of our resources. I mean, one good thing about, being, a person of color is, man, you know how to stretch a dollar. Like you really do. And you know how to really sort of lean in, create those deep, meaningful partnerships, and you know how to leverage resources. And so I was honored to do that and have people like Presley really supporting and helping me. And I do think that if if I didn't have the perspective of who I was and my sort of lived experience, I just don't know if I could have sort of navigated all of that. And so I pull on, and I'm just using myself as an example, but as people of color, we can pull from a historical sort of strength. And when we think about what's happened in our country, over the last year, especially as sort of the racial reckoning was taking place, I think it was very important for us to talk from a place of authenticity. Um, and so I do think it's extremely important as leaders of color to, get the resources we need, but also I think as a field, we need to really figure out how do we create these pipelines and where do we see the sort of breaks in those pipelines from not allowing leaders to fully sort of matriculate and fully sort of realize their leadership potential. What leaders of color are asking for, or professionals of color are asking for, are fair opportunities. And they're looking for those deep sort of experiences. And so, one of the things we are doing as part of the CEO Circle is we are developing a national survey, and we're interviewing professionals of color. We want to know where they are, what their aspirations are, where their challenges have been. Because we cannot create sort of strategies to shore up this leadership pipeline if we're not really sure where we're losing people. So I think, that's one thing, is that, we're actually doing something now. Like we've been doing something, but we're actually sort of being a lot more intentional about keeping the door open behind us and really figuring out for professionals, younger professionals of color, like, what are those sort of, those gaps, those challenges, those rich experiences that never happened. Like, where are those like huge gaps, and then how can we begin to fill them? So I think that's one of the things, that we're doing. And I also think, and not to get too much into solutions, because I know you're probably going to ask us, what do we do next? But, to Presley's point, I also think as leaders of color right now that we do have a responsibility to, to mentor, to create opportunities with one another, to deeply we all need to be accountable to the communities in which we serve. It doesn't matter, what color I am. And I also think as a person of color, I think it takes on a whole new meaning. I mean, again, what we've been through as a country, as a world, I do think that it calls for just a very acute level of transparency. And so I do think that in my position as a leader of color, as of a national organization, that I do a lot of listening. I do a lot of holding space. And I also have to provide a lot of resources, for my staff and for our constituents and for the communities in which we live in, because these are times that we've never seen these in our lifetime. And so, in my final analysis here, I'm very hopeful about, again, not only this conversation, but the various conversations we are having across this country around, strengthening leaders of color, but also not just talking about it as rhetoric, but being more sort of strategic about sort of what that looks like and what are sort of the supports we need to shore up to make sure that we are seeing the sort of normal, healthy progression and matriculation of leaders.
So that survey seems quite interesting, and I'm sure many of our participants on the call will be interested in either participating or hearing the results of that survey. So please keep us updated on that. As well as I do want to encourage folks that we will be doing questions and answers from the audience. So please enter your questions and answers into the function on the left side of your screen, as well as please continue the conversation in the chat. Presley, I want to go over to you because Neighborhood Allies is doing some really interesting work in building capacity and cultivating change makers. So, can you tell me a little bit about the programs that you all are leading that's developing and feeding into a pipeline of leaders of color?
Great question. Great question. Um, we clearly recognize that there are capacity challenges, certainly at the neighborhood level, that we are trying to address with financial resources, with building social capital, and helping folks get connected to the resources that they need. But I think one of the things we first have to think about is, what are those barriers, and where does it begin? I mean, how do you begin to think about how you attract? One of the challenges we have in Pittsburgh is, frankly, and honestly, retaining Black leadership in our city. And so where do you begin to build that pipeline? And I think, one of the things we have to start thinking about is looking right in our neighborhoods, looking right in our communities, to the folks that are, again, with the lived experience, that's closest to the problems and challenges, and frankly, have the solutions within them. We just have to help activate those and unleash the ingenuity within our community. So that's looking at our neighborhoods. That's, young, middle-aged, old, men, women, binary, et cetera. And so one of the things we've been trying to really understand is, how do we make sure that we're not just looking at sort of traditional means of, attraction of talent, and so that means looking at, people with lived experience and knowledge and the ability can actually help transform our communities, but may not neatly fit into the box. They may not neatly fit into these professional spaces and professional settings. So it's not going to always be, the ones coming through, Ivy League universities. It's going to be folks that, may not have had the opportunity to get those higher levels of education. It may be folks that have had challenges, even within the criminal justice system. One of the newer policies around ban the box, I think is incredible to supporting that. So we're looking at, like, are we, in terms of some of the academic requirements that we set on certain positions, are those showing biases? Are those, marginalizing, certain, leaders and potential leadership, and really investing more time and energy in attracting or time and resources to attract top talent and people of color. So we're really trying to look at a lot of those, those barriers to attracting folks to begin with in the pipeline. For our mid-career professionals, we're looking at, how do we bring people together and begin to, understand what their challenges are. And so we partnered with one organization by the name of New Sun Rising, and created a leadership resilience program. This program is really focused on, how do we develop and maintain healthy leaders? Because as we've already illuminated, when we're unhealthy ourselves, whether that's mentally, whether that's emotionally, socially, financially, we can't do the job. And more, we're called to do above and beyond. As Dr. Watkins said, we never forget about work. We never really, we all have to get better at our self-care, but realistically, and particularly working virtually, it never stops. So, making sure that we are developing healthier, hearts and minds of our leaders. So we created an initiative that's bringing about 15 or so leaders through a cohort on an annual basis. And we're really trying to focus on, the emotional health, self-awareness, We're trying to focus on building their social capital. We're actually assigning them mentors and sponsors, which is someone, and I happen to be one of those mentors that can just talk over challenges that they've seen both within building their organization, particularly through a time of crisis, to what are their goals, what are their career challenges, and I think providing that level of mentorship for mid-career professionals, obviously along with other professional development and other types of, conferences and other types of learning. But I think that one-on-one peer development and coaching and really just somebody to talk to, I think is absolutely a critical. And I think it's something that needs to be funded, because, I think what we've already known and what hopefully is becoming more clear is we can't just put funding, into programs without funding the leaders that are needed to implement and execute those programs. We need to put funding into, operational and operating resources to make sure that we can build the resilience of those leaders. So, that's kind of one of the things we're doing in terms of leadership at the mid-career and professional perspective. I'm also excited about, some work that we're doing around building leadership and connectivity and capacity with younger, early stage, nonprofit development entities, both for-profit and nonprofit. We know there's a lot of development activity in many of our cities, including Pittsburgh. But what we're not doing is connecting the dots to make sure that, younger Black leaders, entrepreneurs, and developers systematically have a seat at that table, systematically have access to the capital, whether that's banking capital, whether that's access to capital, just to be able to have working capital, whether that's access to talent and other types of supply chain opportunities. So we created what we call the Centralized Real Estate Accelerator that's really meant to revolutionize community-based real estate development in Pittsburgh and build capacity across organizations and nonprofits and for-profits to both participate and benefit from the revitalization, as well as begin to really look at connecting the dots on building wealth in our communities to make sure that, we're not just continuing to focus on signature projects, but we're focused on how we can move people, families, entrepreneurs up the socioeconomic ladder as a result of all of the development that's happening. And heretofore, that really hasn't happened. It's really been about high capacity developers, largely, white developers that already have access to, generational wealth, that have access to family wealth, that can make mistakes and be forgiven. Whereas when you think about, Black entrepreneurs, Black leaders of these companies and organizations, as a society, we're much less forgiving. When folks have challenges and problems, in many cases, it can derail and in some cases completely halt, their visions, their missions, and what they're trying to do. So we know there's a lot of social capital that we have to get better at connecting. So those are two examples of some things that we're really trying to do to build talent, to build a pipeline, to build leadership and capacity, and then ultimately, how do we connect that to wealth building, and frankly, moving folks up the socioeconomic ladder.
Thanks, Presley. So we have some interesting questions that came through the chat, and I'm going to try to get to a few of them. The first really goes to this question, digging deeper on resources. So when leaders of color are already at a deficit, how can these leaders get the resources to do more when you have to have something to get something? So I'll go to you, Dr. Watkins.
Yeah, that is, you know what? That is the conundrum. you know, um, and I think it's an unfair conundrum. I don't even know if I particularly have sort of a way out from that. I mean, I think it's unfair to give an organization that is ran by a leader of color $300,000 and expect $1 million worth of outcomes. So, you know, so I think a couple things. One is that part of what we have to do is do more funder education. We have to really talk to funders, and we have to let them know exactly sort of what is realistic with the funding they have given us. And I think it can't just be from like one organization. We have to constantly say it. We have to say it as a collective. So, that's the first thing, is to really show up and be honest and open and transparent with funders. And also, as leaders of color, sometimes I think we think we have to promise everybody the world, right? Like, because, to Presley's point, if you're in these positions, you want to do the best you can because it's a lot riding on you. There's a lot of people depending on you, and you don't want to let people down. But I also think it's important to also be realistic about what can happen. We're not superheroes. I know we talk a lot about magic and stuff, but we're not. We're mere mortals, and so I just think it's important to be honest as leaders about what is realistically appropriate for the level of funding that we get from funders, and to be honest with funders about that. I also think, though, that we also have to look at the funding we do get, and how we can leverage that funding and then actually maximize that funding. And so, I at Center for Community Progress, we have done a lot more work around affordable housing. I mean, we help municipal governments unlock vacant and abandoned and deteriorated properties, and we can put those properties in the pipeline for affordable housing. And so, while we are not funded to do affordable housing in any sort of like mass scale, what we did was that we started to partner with organizations like Grounded Solutions, like NeighborWorks, America, and other organizations like that can help us sort of leverage our unique value we bring to the table. And the great thing about those organizations are that they have amazing leadership, and we can all be value aligned. And so I think it's important for us as leaders of color to be honest, be transparent, be honest with ourselves, and be transparent with funders about what is realistic. We cannot, and I will repeat this, we cannot do more with less. That is setting a very dangerous precedent, and it's unrealistic and not sustainable. And to Presley's point, in terms of the deep work that we do to support our staffs and support the emerging leaders and mid-career leaders, we need support. We need, to Presley's point, we're never off. We're dealing with huge amounts of very deep and complex issues that go well beyond sort of just organizational challenges. We are dealing with issues that there is no sort of leadership training that you could take for the sort of type of challenges that hit our desk daily. And I do think that the field has to look at how we do not burn out leaders of color, how we create safe and nurturing spaces for them so they can come, they can be honest, they can build trust, they can work through challenges, they can get replenished so they can go out and do their jobs better. And so, I mean, at least that was my hope when I created the CEO Circle, was to create that space for leaders. And so and we did, and in so many ways we did that without sort of traditional formalized funding. But I do think in order to scale it and make it impactful, we do need support to do that.
So, Presley, this next question is for you. What does a leader of color need from a city government or agency to be supported in the work that they do? In many cases, the leader of color is a direct conduit from an agency to the residents and the first point of contact for both groups.
That's a great question. These are good questions coming in. I think one of the things that we first and foremost, we have to recognize that, government has to be a part of the solution. Um, and, I do sometimes find that, folks in our communities, and again, well justified in many cases, don't trust, the government. They don't, frankly, trust people in power. And I think what we've had to continue to do is, you know, be that bridge and that conduit of building that trust in our communities. We've seen, we know historically what's occurred. A lot of the, a lot of the urban renewal policies have decimated our communities, gentrified our communities, and a lot of that has historically been led by government and government institutions that were, that have now reckoned with, the bad policies that have really created a lot of the challenges that we face today. But I'm also encouraged that we now have lots of leaders within city government. I see that occurring greatly in Pittsburgh, where we see leaders within city government recognizing that, they have caused harm, or their predecessors have caused harm to our communities, and we're acknowledging that harm, and we're now putting new policies in place, new people, new bridge builders, and new partnerships in place to reverse that. But just saying that is not going to change the perceptions in our community. So I think, building partnerships with city government, other elected officials is absolutely critical. And I think we're doing that very well in Pittsburgh at Neighborhood Allies, in building partnerships with the Urban Redevelopment Authority, with the mayor's office, and starting to really recognize the value, or should I say, our partners are really recognizing the value and the power of our convening ability, the power of our trust that we've built in our community. So I think from a government perspective is recognizing that these community organizations, community-based organizations, community development corporations, and others have the ability to bridge that trust building, because we can only be successful really at the speed of trust. And we've got a lot of work to do there in building or rebuilding the trust in our communities from the grassroots to the grass tops levels. And I think government partners understanding that they have to, you know, you know, acknowledge the harm that's been caused. If we don't acknowledge it, then we can't build that trust. And partnering with folks on the ground, partnering with intermediaries like ourselves to be able to help bridge that trust, build that trust, and importantly, begin to build the capacity and provide the technical resources in our communities that are so greatly needed to build capacity and to actually transform our neighborhoods to places where folks have access to regional and shared prosperity. We're starting to see that happen. I'm excited about that. I'm very optimistic that that will continue to grow. I will say that, we are on the cusp of electing our first Black mayor in the city's history in Pittsburgh. Not to get too political, but that's a big thing. And, we're seeing, that change occur in multiple cities across the country. And again, though, I think what we need to continue to do is build on the partnerships and the trust that we have continued to build with city government. And so I'm proud of the fact that we've built those great partnerships. We built that trust with our mayor's office. We created, our financial empowerment centers, which is significantly improving the financial outcomes for, low income residents, Black and brown residents. We've built significant partnership with the Urban Redevelopment Authority in providing technical resources to economic development organizations and entrepreneurs. But I think that takes time, but you have to invest in that. You have to invest in building those partnerships, and you have to trust that your partners can get the job done. And but you also, there's an implication of looking at policy and really being proactive at how do we begin to change the policies within our cities, statewide, to again invest in the types of things that are really 21st century approaches. So thinking out of the box is absolutely important for city government, but we also have to recognize that city government alone, sort of this vertical partnership, this vertical approach to the work is not going to solve these challenges. It has to be horizontal. And we have to look at our city, both at the city government level, across the city and across the county, as building horizontal relationships and being proactive at bringing other partnerships to the table. Because again, city government can't solve it alone. The nonprofit sector can't solve it alone. So we have to be, proactive at seeking to build other larger cross-sectional multidisciplinary partnerships that can transform our cities. But again, the city has to not only be a partner, but a leader in that, and really setting the tone and helping to set the example. I'm very optimistic at what I see happening in Pittsburgh. I'm very proud of the partnerships and the work that has already been done, again, with our city, with our mayor's office, with our county officials, and that work needs to continue.
Trust, investment, and mentorship. Those are the themes that I heard today. I want to thank Dr. Akilah Watkins, and thank you, Presley Gillespie, for joining us as our panelists. And thank you all to the participants for participating in this conversation and really continuing on this important dialogue. Thank you for joining us today.